Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Transformation Managers Forum Seminar Series. I hope everyone is doing well this afternoon. My name is Sianne from the Transformation Office, and I am excited to be your host or your facilitator for this conversation. And we are pleased that you are able to join us today. But here's what you can expect for today's program. We are going to be having an exciting conversation, starting off with the welcoming that we'll be getting from Professor Andrew Kitt. And after that, we will be introducing our speakers and having a question and answer session after our speakers and a vote of thanks. But just to remind everyone again, before we even begin, to please use the chat function. Please use the chat function to share your questions, thoughts, your comments. But now, without wasting any time, allow me to call on stage, the virtual stage, Prof. Andrew Kitt.
Thank you so much, Vuyo, for that very warm invitation. Colleagues, as you can see, this is one of those key areas of discussions that we should continue perpetually in so many different spaces. And we are grateful today, the Nelson Mandela Transformation Office headed by Ruby Ann. So a great thanks to her and her team. It's Vuyo and Rachel as well for holding this together. And our organizing partners, the Unit for Institutional Change and Social Justice at the University of the Free State, the Stellenbosch University Transformation Office, and the WITS Transformation and Employment Equity Division, the WITS Intercultural and Diversity Studies, WICETS, the Transformation Managers Forum as a community of practice, linked to the Transformation Strategy Group. And as you know, that this is part of a series of conversations focusing on elements of the transformation barometer. There has been four hosted now in 2021. The one in July focused on theoretical lenses and implication for transformation practice. This one is on governance and structure. And then, of course, we will have in September decolonial feminist and intersectional analysis, which will be hosted by Stellenbosch University. And then we will have decolonization praxis hosted by WITS Transformation Office and WICETS as well. And then the idea is to have these presentations being converted into publications for a special journal, for a special edition of the journal the International Journal of Critical Diversity Studies. So with that, please feel warmly welcome into the space at our university's virtual platform. And I am especially heartened by the fact that the discussions and the reflections, the critique, the build-outs, the amendments on the transformation barometer is continuing. At that time, when we as a team put this together, George will remember those battles that we had, over the past 10 odd years. We tried to work out what type of thematic areas can we as a collective focus on when we engage with the transformation challenges within our university. And as you know, these kinds of framings needs to be contested as we move along. And so I'm grateful that the Transformation Managers Forum via these events is doing precisely that. So I'm looking forward to that special edition of the journal and the reflections that will come out of it. But for now, let me then also give a warm welcome to a good friend of ours, George Mvalo. George, thanks for always being there around the transformation matters of the university. I know that Dr. Johnson couldn't make it, but thanks to her as well for being willing to do so. And then Dr. Cyan Elves, of course, from UCT as well, who has also been an amazing co-traveler in the higher education transformation space. I have already, relayed my thanks to our organizing partners and to my colleagues here at Nelson Mandela University. So with that, colleagues, please feel welcome. And there you are. Thanks so much, Vuyo.
Thank you so much, Prof. Kit. And I would like now to introduce our first presenter. But before I do that, please note that Dr. Johnson, as indicated by Prof. Kit, could not be with us today due to personal tragedy. Our first presenter for this afternoon, Mr. George Mvalo, is currently the Director of Social Justice and Transformation at the Vaal University of Technology in Gauteng. He is responsible inter alia for institutional transformation, employment equity, disability services, stakeholder management, and advocacy and awareness. He gained insights in the workings of institutional forum during his role as the chairperson of the CPUT Institutional Forum. He is currently the chairperson of the Youth Transformation Managers Forum, a community of practice which plays an advisory role on sectoral transformation in South Africa.
Thank you so much, Program Director. Good afternoon, to the virtual participants. We are very pleased, actually, that you could join us in this particular conversation on very important topics. As I'm about to start my presentation, allow me to just remind us why we are presenting today. It's on the Institutional Forum. My title for my topic is on the Institutional Forum, a weak cog in cooperative governance. So, colleagues, yes, where does one really start, on a very, very important topic, on governance in higher education? So the reason that actually we thought maybe we need to also put a spotlight on the Institutional Forum is because of its centrality in the transformation project. The presentation will definitely look in terms of 6 broad areas. I will look in terms of historical background briefly on the broad transformation forums, the precursors to the IF. I will look at the cooperative governance in the South Africa, but also I look at what they call the intersectionality / power play discourse. And then I will then look at the governance models, and then the challenges facing the IF, and then I will give my final thoughts. So as I begin, is that, as I mentioned, that there is indeed, a role to be played in terms of governance within higher education in South Africa and the world over. But there's 2 particular aspects that I want, to share with or put on the table this afternoon. One of those actually is the models that institutions of higher learning or higher education systems actually adopt. One of those, the corporate governance model, which is the cost structure, within its cost structure is concerned with the organizational functionality as well as the distribution of power amongst its various stakeholders. That is actually one definition really that I thought I will share with you around corporate governance. But the South African variety is cooperative governance. And for a simple reason that it is a formalized model of shared governance within public universities in South Africa. So because of its shared governance orientation, it takes a slightly different but yet very important role because it becomes now a creature of statute, of the legislation, but also, if I can say, it derives its powers from the Constitution of 1996. But also because this model is a shared governance model, it is based in the main on its multi-stakeholder aspects. or composition, and also on deepening transformation through consensus. I think that's very important. It's around consensus in terms of decision making rather than the previous actually dispensation where diktat actually ruled the roost. But also is that the cooperative governance is underpinned by principles of social justice, equity, and democratization. So higher education, therefore, governance brings us in our next slide to a brief, look in terms of intersectionality, because I thought if one were to just briefly look at three, pillars around power, around race, around academic projects, you will find that there is an interplay between these pillars in our higher education institutions. But also when it comes to power, you will therefore agree with me that sometimes tensions present themselves between the advisory role of IFs to councils and the perceptions of an accountability to management or by management. And this is sometimes something that does not sit well, with some of those in power. And also, this is what I call the perception of what I would call the javelin throwing. By this I mean is that some constituencies who constitute institutional fora are able, when actually they could not get their way in the proper platforms, let's say around student fees or collective bargaining, they are able to think actually they can bring some of these discussions to the IF, but also there's another tension between who should lead these important bodies. Should it be the vice chancellor or subordinates, in terms of the power hierarchy of institutions, but also this tension around the elected and the appointed is something that sometimes is able to find expression in our higher education actually spaces. But also the issue around race, if one were to look at that pillar, is that it is something that in terms of the composition of these actually committees, these bodies, issues around gender, issues around class, they do find expression. But because these bodies play an important role, for instance, around issues of recruitment, they then actually do play also a role in the demographic transformation project within our institutions. And the last pillar speaks really around, the academic project, which, if one were to quote Beverly Faber, that there are indeed complexities associated with the implementation of change at the micro level of these institutions. So transformation of staffing profile, becomes one of those that has to be aligned with student demographic shifts. So power, race, gender, I say, does impact, on the missions of our universities. But the next slide will then briefly look at a historical background about these broad transformation forums, the precursors to the institutional forum. I think, colleagues, those who can still remember, that there was indeed just on the dawn of democracy, a vibrancy around how institutions of higher learning in apartheid South Africa needed to change and to change rapidly. And these were then led to these broad transformation forums, which were quite vocal about the centrality of democratization within institutions. So they played a central role, and they became parallel structures to university councils and senates during the transitional periods leading to the dismantling of apartheid in 1994. So before then, these were structures that were really actively involved in the democratization of the South African university space for hitherto marginalized voices. They challenged the legitimacy of senates and councils, but also they wanted their space on the table as well. So it was essentially a platform for change from the ground up, premised on the full participation of stakeholders. But also what was quite useful is that they were quite vocal on national issues affecting universities. A space to call out intransigents or untransformed university leaders, and they played a pivotal role in the massification of higher education, especially diversifying of the student body from predominantly white to black bodies, but in the main students. So the BTFs, or the Broad Transformation Forums, therefore, were these bodies that were active during the throes of negotiation politics in the era preceding South Africa's democratic dispensation. That's what actually Griffin also alludes to. And GLab and Johnson also makes a point that the BTFs were also aimed at bringing about the redistribution of power and democratization of key areas of South African society. But within universities, the democratization of key institutions of power, like your councils, your senates, so they were formed, therefore, not least through or due to student activism and advocacy for a more open, relevant, and non-discriminatory higher education system. So these were the precursors, as I said, to the bodies now that we call the institutional forum. So transformation forums, as I said earlier, are creatures of statute. But what makes them different or unique is that, according to Sodin and Griffin, that this was a governance innovation that was incorporated into the transformation strategy for public universities. Think again in terms of pre-94, untransformed universities, quite resistant to change, and now you have a lever via IFs, to advance the transformation project. So that was the novelty around these bodies, but also that they were multi-stakeholder in their orientation, as I've indicated earlier. So the establishment of IFs, therefore, was based on the central role played by their precursors, the Broad Transformation Forums, that were formed, as I said, as parallel structures to university councils and synods. But these bodies were not just formed, but also they had a particular role to play. So what was their mandate? In a nutshell, one has to go back to the National Commission on Higher Education of 1996. This is where, in preparation to see how society, but also how higher education has to transform, the basics and the fundamentals were laid for a body that can resemble the Broad Transformation Forum. But when the legislation came about, is that the name was changed, or it transitioned to a IF, or Institutional Forum, with a focus on democratization of governance. This also involved actually the monitoring as well as the implementation of the Higher Education Act and policy. This body was to be charged with race and gender equity policies, selection of executive managers who were going to lead these institutions, codes of conduct, mediation and dispute resolution procedure, as well as foster and ensure an institutional culture that creates an appropriate environment for teaching, for research and learning, as well as tolerance and respect for human rights. But these bodies I want to actually venture to say, had a broad mandate, not a narrow mandate, because they had to really grapple with the transformation project of the entire university. So even they could also advance or deal or address any other functions that will be referred to it by the university councils. Just to give actually us a fleeting, actually a fleeting fly past in terms of when you talk about IFs, you also have to be mindful that these were bodies, as I said, amongst their mandates to ensure that they have to monitor the effective implementation of higher education policy and legislation. And so that means this is a very important mandate that they carry. For instance, if we want to go to 1996, the Constitution, the National Commission on Higher Education, for instance, the Education White Paper 3, a program for the transformation of higher education, the Higher Education Act of the same year, and the Employment Equity Act, a very, very critical legislation that now was at the disposal of workplaces like universities. I also mentioned further down in 2001, the National Plan on Higher Education, the 2002 cabinet decisions on the size and shape of higher education, which led, by the way, to the mergers and corporations of universities. If one were to go further than that, in terms of looking at the scope of the work that these bodies, are expected to engage. If you remember, before the new ministry, then just after the new ministry or the previous administration, the split between DBE and higher education, a summit was held in 2010, pardon me, which led to the Higher Education Declaration as well. This was followed 5 years down the line by the second Higher Education Summit with its Durban Declaration. And it was in that summit that also, actually the previous summit, where also the 2008 report, which was called the Soudin report, was also adopted in total, by the delegates. Around 2016, Transformation at Public Universities in South Africa report came out by the South African Human Rights Commission, the draft national plan for post-school education and training, the strategic framework for people with disabilities. So this shows you, colleagues, the scope of work around transformation in our universities. As I about now to close, I thought it will be also relevant for us to look also briefly at the challenges of the institutional forum around their spheres of influence, spheres of recognition, around outcomes. When it comes to influence, I did mention, for instance, the tensions between transformation and accountability, tension between its advisory role at the IF, that is, to council, and the perception thereof, but also the weight of advice given to councils and how the council values such advice, but also the transitory nature of key constituencies in this multi-stakeholder body. Particularly here, one refers to the student body, a very, very important constituency. When it comes, therefore, to recognition, bear in mind that I said this is actually creature of legislation. But still, these bodies do, from time to time, experience ambivalent attitudes, by some executive managers and vice chancellors. But also, these bodies, by the way, are a site for the promotion of democratic citizenship. but also students, labor, academics, administrators, management, and governance participate in deliberative democracy and joint decision making. And this body makes that possible. But you will therefore also find, whilst these bodies actually face these challenges, I will submit that there does not appear to be a semblance of a fail-proof mechanism as a recourse when its continued functionality is threatened or undermined. When it comes, therefore, to outcomes of how this critical body in terms of governance of universities plays, there is the perception of failure of deliberative democracy as heralded in higher education legislation. That's what Griffiths actually points out. But also Boland then argues therefore that perhaps there's a need to strengthen the values of political democracy within universities. And IFs are at the coalface of strengthening those values of political democracy within our universities, as well as the ability of universities in introducing democratic ideals, practices, and values of participation, equity, and social justice. So lastly, here is where one of the outcomes really speaks to institutional culture itself as a function of governance. Remember, when I spoke about the mandate of these important structures, I did mention about their role in terms of institutional culture. Ladies and gentlemen, then allow me in closing to share with you some final thoughts on the question that I posed earlier about, these bodies. I attempted here to indicate the novelty of IF as a governance structure in South Africa's higher education system, that these bodies seems to exist in tension between its advisory function and exigencies to hold university management accountable for the transformation, but also that there's a tension between its advisory role to council and perceptions of an accountability to management, something that does not sit well with some vice chancellors. And also the tension between who should lead the IF. But when it comes to the impact, that the impact of IF has at times not as been as envisaged by policy makers. So this change, in the establishment of IFs in university governance was expected to bring positive benefits to the tertiary sector, argues Griffin. So therefore, in certain contexts, the IFs have to contend with the dice loaded against their favor. As a result, at times, the IFs have, for various reasons, become moribund, thus impacting on their legitimacy. So it is debatable what role, if any, IFs, for example, played or continue to play in the decolonization of the curriculum occasioned by the 2015-16 forest movements. But when it comes to the future of these bodies, I submit that the IFs still need to fulfill their original disruptive orientation to the status quo. And that the IF is arguably one of the few multi-stakeholder groups that are positioned to foster organizational transformation. Perhaps it's a bit early to measure the effect of the Higher Education Amendment Act of 2016, which is aimed at strengthening the function of this body. So therefore, in conclusion, colleagues, there is a need for the IF to play a coordinating role in the transformation of South Africa's universities, particularly with regards to what I call the 4 missions of organizational culture, teaching and learning, research, and community engagement. So I thank you, colleagues, for this opportunity around what I called a very important topic, whether IFs are a weak cog in cooperative governance in higher education. Thank you so much.
Right, thank you so much, Mr. Mvalo, for such an insightful presentation. Before we move any further, I'd like to remind the people who have joined us today to please use the chat function to share with us your questions, your thoughts, your comments. We would like to actually interact with you during this conversation. So please use that chat function to ask your questions, comments. And now, what we are going to do is to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Cyan Elves. Dr. Cyan Elves is a scholar practitioner who has worked nationally in multi-sectoral partnerships that are dedicated towards preventing and responding to oppression and social justice. Previously, Dr. Elves headed up the South African chapter of an international NGO as a development consultant for government and community organizations. Dr. Alves has formed part of the Ministerial Commission for Gender-Based Violence in the higher education sector. She was a senior reviewer for the European Conference on Education for the International Academic Forum and presented at international conferences as well as many national conferences. Sianne has published 7 peer-reviewed articles and 1 book chapter on a range of social justice issues ranging from HIV and AIDS, curriculum design, and gender in industry. Her research area is focusing on the conceptualization of governance and management systems that amplify the voice and agency of previously marginalized and oppressed communities. Currently, Sianne is the director of the Office for Inclusivity and Change, which is a unit that provides, prevention and education on issues of race, gender, and anti-oppression. The OIC also provides disability services, survivor support, restorative justice programs, capacity building, and culture change approaches that seek to reduce oppression and inequality. Cyan Elves brings to the position of director her multi-sectoral expertise across international and national government, cooperative, and civil society contexts. An alumni of the University of Cape Town, University of Free State, and the University of Stellenbosch, she has experience of multiple higher education contexts in South Africa, which assists in keeping abreast of, and in some instances, pioneering systemic change for transformation, inclusion, and equity within UCT. Sianne is a mother of 2 incredible children who center her purpose and motivation, which is to contribute to equality in South Africa. And now, everyone, allow me to bring on stage Dr. Cyan Elves. Over to you, Doc.
Thank you so much, Vuyo, for such a wonderful presentation. And good afternoon, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with you today. For the purpose of ease of access, I'm just going to switch off my video and share with you my screen. I'd like to thank the hosts, Prof. Keats, Dr. Levendale, Dr. Kelly, and Professor Steyn for accepting my research and this opportunity to present my research. And from the brief provided today, I understand that this is really a space for critical reflection of our work as transformation practitioners, where we can explore the approaches that we're using within higher education environments. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation today to create a dialogical learning space for ourselves. My presentation today presents a series of thoughts and insights that interrogates the locations of power within and external to the university that disables the work of transformation and inclusive action. And before I begin, I'd like to clarify a few terms. when defining transformation, I draw primarily from Sudin's definition of transformation as an ideological process which engages and redresses histories of colonialism and apartheid. And this definition is really deepened by Keats' analysis of the economies of transformation that enables cultural change. And in my research, transformation and the action of inclusion are interdependent. Inclusivity here referring to practices that are employed to enable full participation and success for those who have been previously excluded. And my research focuses on the inclusion of a marginalized population based on research conducted in 5 universities at a particular time point between 2014 and 2017. And colleagues will recall that this period of time in the history of universities was marked by the 4-list movements. And as such, my data is indicative of the discourse of that time. And I will end off with a more current analysis and questioning around what is hindering inclusion within higher education. The overall purpose of the study was to explore the structures that enabled inclusion for marginalized student population. And the findings of this study lend itself quite usefully for transformation practitioners to think beyond the limitations of centralized governance to produce inclusive higher education spaces. And George's presentation earlier really provides such a wonderful foundation of thinking about the centrality of power and how power can sometimes prevent and hinder authentic and meaningful change within a particular space. Just going to transition. So in terms of the structure of my presentation, I begin with the theoretical positioning. I share the primary research questions related to governance, the findings, and I conclude with considerations for inclusion of programs for social justice and for transformation. In terms of the theoretical position, I myself consider myself to be a critical theorist who oscillates between modern and postmodern views. And this positionality becomes quite an important analytical lens because there's an intentional focus on critically analyzing systems of power and governance so that the structural barriers that sustain oppression are removed. And this study was framed upon Alves' theory that universities replicate societal ideologies through action and practice, and that universities themselves are potentially complicit in replicating societal norms and practices, some of which may be discriminatory and oppressive. My research was also interdisciplinary in nature. It intersected with management, it intersected with health sciences and social sciences, but for the purposes of this discussion today, I will focus solely on the management findings that emerged from research in order to surface the barriers that existed centrally, which excluded marginalized populations. And I do this intentionally to help us think through praxis so that transformation practitioners like myself can really grapple with the tension that is experienced with finding ourselves in positions of negotiation and advocacy for social justice imperatives, despite university governance knowing that they have a constitutional and therefore legal obligation to provide an inclusive learning environment. And so I will hold the central tension of the constitutional obligation and the centrality of governance, executive governance, in the forefront of your mind throughout this presentation today. In terms of the sample, 5 universities geographically dispersed in South Africa participated. All of the universities had comparable infrastructure and human support, and they implemented the same program for inclusion for the same over a same period of time, duration of time, which was 3 years. And it was applied both primarily within a student population, but very quickly began to include the staff. And the key questions, there were 5 questions that were posed, and 2 of these questions related to the organizational structure and stakeholders that enabled or acted as barriers to inclusion within the 5 universities. And these questions were: how are internal stakeholders in higher education institutions organized to respond to and support inclusion? And the second question that focused on power and location were the factors that facilitated or impeded inclusion in higher education institutions. Colleagues, I'll move now to my findings, and these are arranged into 3 thematic areas. The first finding was that of the obligations of a university in light of the Constitution and in light of the Higher Education Act that the earlier presenter spoke to in much detail. The second finding suggests that the inclusion program, the transformation imperatives, needs to be connected to both the social as well as critically connected to the academic project of the university, rather than being implemented alongside of the university strategy. And lastly, the third theme focuses on, well, questions really, the centralized power in its most traditional sense. So going to my first finding, if the obligation of universities is clearly defined by the Higher Education Act, and as a public institution, universities are bound by the Constitution, then I ask, how is it that imperatives for inclusion in universities are negotiable? The suggestive evidence from the research showed that executive management and/or other institutional stakeholders may not have had a clear understanding of how to implement transformation and inclusion obligations conferred upon them by the Constitution, as well as the Higher Education Act. In addition, it was apparent from the research that the marginalized groups did not access legal remedies that are supported by the Chapter 9 institutions, which demonstrated in my mind that there's a limited accountability for the university and its stakeholders to be held to account. So as a result of the limited application of these obligations by both the university, its leadership, we find that transformation and inclusion practitioners end up negotiating inclusion, which is subject to many variables, such as personal political beliefs, subjectivity, and existing cultures. And that impact, that confluence of variables impacts negatively on transformation imperatives, because there's a lack of institutional accountability, which ensures that universities are inclusive and socially cohesive sites of learning and living. Second finding was the linkage to the academic program. Now, Habermas writes that if students perceive academia to be distanced from the realities of society, it is likely that they will question the knowledge economy and the purpose of a university. Habermas also indicates that universities are not divorced from the politics, economies, or civil influences of the country, as evidenced by the student movements that identified the increasing gap between the knowledge taught at university and the application to South African challenges. And we know as practitioners that the application of transformation in higher education is really a combined approach between the academic and the social enterprise of the university. For example, one cannot be an excellent academic if they act inhumanely. And similarly, one cannot be an effective practitioner if the programs we deploy are not connected to emerging research on transformative justice. So we know that the linkage to the academic program and the strength of transformation work rests in praxis, and thus means that in some ways the inclusion and transformation programs must be connected to the academic endeavor of the university. So what does this mean? If the inclusion and transformation programs remain distanced, then there will be a greater disconnection from the overall university strategic objectives, and that impairs the ability to have inclusive, socially cohesive university living and learning spaces. In terms of my third finding, the locations of power in universities, we know from the time point of 2014 to 2017 that the student movements compelled university leadership to become more responsive to and effective against forms of oppression and discrimination. The student movement challenged power and produced rapid change. And what is evident is now we know that students must be the partners in inclusion efforts in universities. In fact, that is a fundamental finding. Without the students' voice, we cannot hold a transformation inclusion program separate to the student approach. Staff and students need to find each other through this program and begin to speak and believe and live the inclusive language and culture that we seek as enshrined in the Constitution. The research further suggests that the efficacy or implementation of the inclusion program is seemingly not dependent on the support of executive management. I'll repeat that. The research suggested that the efficacy or implementation of the inclusion program was not dependent on the support of executive management, because all program coordinators, regardless of the levels of support or lack of support, were able to achieve similar outcomes. As a critical theorist, I find this finding for me is the most intriguing, as the data highlights that leadership is not localized to the Vice Chancellor and the Deputy Vice Chancellors, and that in the implementation of inclusion programs, devolved leadership within the university produced the same level of institutional receptivity and support. That being said, it is also important to note where executive did not agree to have an inclusion program in the university, then access to support and services was completely absent. This raised questions about executive subjectivity, which may be in direct contradiction to the constitutional obligations of a public institution. One example that was raised by a participant is where a vice chancellor changed halfway through the program, and a new vice chancellor was completely in support of the program and enabled access rapidly, which was in stark contrast to the previous vice chancellor's discriminatory position. Subjectivity of leaders, therefore, seems to have bearing on the success of transformation. However, there is a tension in the data, and up on your screen, you'll see a couple of quotations lifted directly from the research. You'll see that there's quite a range. The first quote says, "I think our Vice Chancellor made it so easy for us to do whatever work we needed to do. As long as we were situated underneath the Vice Chancellor's office, we got more leeway and clout to implement these programs." The second was a little bit different. If you've got someone in power and that person is against a certain thing or program, then it's easy to influence everyone on the ground. You know how it is. Power has so much influence. So I think that executive support played a very important role. The third respondent had less success. The Vice Chancellor said no, top management said no, a lot of people shook their heads, and the justification for that engagement was based on religion and culture defending institutional norms and practices, and as a way of how life should be actually led on the university. So you'll see that where executive support was vocal, where executives were involved and expressive, the inclusion program increased substantially in terms of the speed of access and the breadth of support. But on the other hand, where executive support was lacking, or where religion and culture was used to prevent inclusive practices, then the negotiation was increased in other areas of the university to produce the same outcomes. And it was interesting to note that executive support was not necessarily a critical factor in influencing stakeholder receptivity for inclusion programs in the university. In fact, as evidenced in the data, support for the program did not necessarily have to come from the executive. support needed to also come from the lower tiers within the university in order to produce the same desirable outcome for inclusion. So what does this mean? We need to really trouble the centralized leadership and locus of power when it comes to transformation and inclusion. And we need to think about how do we begin to protect the inclusion imperatives when it stands in the face of power, whether that power is held centrally or within other tiers or locations within the university. And it raises an important question when power begins to contradict constitutional obligations that are expected within our universities and as legislated in the Higher Education Act and the White Paper 3 for Transformation. I'm going to move towards the end of my presentation, and I have 3 or 4 more slides that brings forward some considerations that I look forward to discussing with you during the session today. The first is that through the research, we know that there is a successful inclusion strategy for practitioners that not only needs to be simultaneously deployed from the center, but it can be as successful if it is deployed from various tiers within the university. A transformation approach should therefore cultivate support from across the institution, beyond that of executive support and dependency. We need to recognize that we need to critically engage with the politics and bias of leadership and understand how to maintain the independence of inclusion objectives which are informed by the Constitution. And that last bullet point for me is something that I continue to grapple with as a transformation practitioner, is the independence of inclusion imperatives in the face of bias. The second consideration is focusing on the absences. It is evident that we need a deeper analysis of transformation and inclusion programs that are helpful to university practitioners and programs that are positioned in a manner that informs praxis. Linkages to the academic and research enterprise is of course critical, but external to the universities, then also needs to be greater cohesion between the multiple government departments, all of whom have bearing on the approach to transformation in the university setting. On your screen, I list a few that you may already be familiar with. The Employment Equity Act governs and dictates how we attract, retain, and promote Black academic staff within the university. We have the Disabilities United Nations Convention, which was ratified by South Africa in 2007, and this influences universal design principles as well as people-designed learning principles within the academic environment. We have the Higher Education Gender-Based Violence Policy, which is a DHET initiative, but holds joint application with the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. We also have the Department of Employment and Labour Codes of Good Practice for Sexual Harassment in the Workplace. And finally, we have the PAPUDA Act, the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Discrimination Act in 2000, which is yet again an initiative of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. And when we're thinking about discrimination, of course, we're thinking about anti-racist practices, a reduction in anti-oppression, institutional racism, structural racism. All collectively, we have approximately 4 government departments that influence how we apply transformation and inclusion imperatives in the university environment. And so my last statement is somewhat contradictory to my presentation, but it's a necessary one because it highlights how, with the devolution of leadership and governance, there still needs to be one cohesive policy, practice, or legislative body to inform an inclusive environment within higher education. Without it, we're going to have to respond in many variable ways to different external and internal institutions that govern inclusion in ways that prioritize different things, whether that be equity, disability, gender-based violence, racism, or sexual misconduct. In closing, I leave you with the key research findings, which in sake of time, I've got 30 seconds to go. I'm not going to repeat, but there are 5 key findings that I think us as transformation practitioners can begin to grapple with as we think about structuring and locating our transformation and inclusion work within the higher education context. And I also leave you with one thinking point that I hope before I hand over to Vuyo, this is my last slide, I hope Vuyo will be able to facilitate in the discussion, is when we come to thinking about inclusion and transformation imperatives, they seem to be dependent on executive agreement rather than being seen as a legal constitutional imperative of a public institution. I would really welcome your feedback and thoughts on that. Thank you, colleagues. I'm going to turn off my slide now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the presenters. We now get to the most exciting part, which is the engagement, and we do have a lot of questions. So I am not going to waste any much time, but let me thank you. Let me thank George Mvalo and Dr. Sianne. I think one thing that stood out for me is that universities are microcosms of society, and it's almost impossible to achieve anything if we are not going to work together. So I'm just going to go to the first question, and it's directed to Mr. George. Dispute resolution as part of the mandate of institutional forum, do we have practical examples of IF successful interventions in universities? If yes, please inform us.
No, I was saying, thanks for that question, and I just wanted to first actually to have a different view about what was said earlier about the universities being microcosms of society. Universities actually will be lacking in ambition if they were to think that actually they just have to be a microcosm. Society looks up to universities. And so how we behave should actually aspire or give inspirations, to communities, to society about what is possible in societal development. Therefore, coming back to the question around the dispute resolution role of the IFs, whether actually they have been successful. It's very difficult, to be honest, because I've been out of that space now for some time to definitively indicate whether they have been successful. But in the past is that, for instance, around issues of languages, you will find that IFs were quite vocal about how African languages, for instance, needed to play a role at the center stage in the academic project. And as you know, this is actually a very emotive topic, but IFs actually have been able actually to play their role there. And hence, perhaps then, you will not really find litigation around that. I hope that actually answers it. Thank you.
In my experience of being in the IF, the student body is not consistent in attendance of meetings. Sometimes they do not attend a single meeting the whole year. Is this a national trend? If it is a national trend, what could be the main reason?
We have to balance the responsibilities of students. They are there to learn in the first place. How we then organize these meetings becomes important. How accommodative are we? Because 99% of the stakeholders of IFs are not students in the main. So if we are sensitive to how we schedule these meetings, students will definitely gladly participate. But there's also another actually dimension here. The one where, for instance, we sometimes by default, we disempower students in participating, and then they feel actually intimidated because actually they've never been properly inducted, for instance, in the work of the IF. So that becomes actually important. But I'm not aware, in conclusion, in terms of whether this is consistent across the sector. But if actually institutions are able to really be flexible in how they schedule their meetings and also involve these students in the agenda setting of these bodies, I'm telling you, you will be able to get actually maximum participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mvalo, for that. Then we have a question from Claire. I'm interested in the idea of institutional culture as a function of governance. Could Mr. Mvalo speak a bit more to this? Does this mean that untransformed institutional cultures are a failure of governance?
Well, no, thanks, Claire, for that. And I cannot agree with you more, that we sometimes take institutional culture for granted. But my argument is that if you have an affirming, welcoming culture, you will also, in a way, have an enabling governance system in place. But the corollary also is true. If your culture, is exclusionary, you will also invariably find that it becomes very, very difficult to have actually a properly functioning, let's say IF, for instance, that is enabled, that is supported, and that actually is able to deliver fully and effectively on its mandate. I hope that answers you.
I am hoping, colleagues, that your questions are being answered, and we do encourage that should you have a follow-up question, please make use of that. And then we have a question that then speaks to the TVET colleges. What about the transformation of the TVET college sector? Is the sector receiving attention?
That's a very actually important question. Remember now, particularly now that actually higher education is just a subsector of this post-school education and training system. But the direct answer is that where I'm sitting, I don't think actually we have really brought TVET colleges to the fold as we're supposed to. So there's room for improvement in terms of how we can ensure that actually there's much more actually improved one collaboration, so that actually we can leverage the transformation of the entire post-school education and training system. Thank you.
Definitely agree with that one. Thank you so much, Mr. Mvalo. We'll now go to Dr. Sianne. How is that universities become constitution-free zones? The fact that we are having to negotiate what a constitutional imperative is bizarre.
Thank you. Thanks, Vuyo, and thanks to Dr. Kelly for raising that important question. So the person who answers this question quite beautifully is Professor Pierre de Vos, and he writes about the constitutional obligations of universities. He wrote about that in 2015. It is bizarre, it is odd that issues of inclusion are up for negotiation. Yes, on one hand, we have to balance the academic project, but surely we should, as an academic environment, trying to find the middle ground where we have praxis that speaks to both the discipline as well as the inclusive principles within those disciplines. Disciplines here, I'm referring to curriculum. So within the academic curriculum, how are we embedding inclusive principles that are dictated via and enshrined through the Constitution? Claire, I'm as puzzled as you, but I think that this is why I'm presenting the research today, to really raise awareness about this important tension. It is not related to your second question as well, Claire. It's not okay that subjectivity and bias and politics of power influence the legal obligations enshrined in the Constitution. I do think that we need to interrogate the roles of the IFs, of the universities in protecting deep, authentic and meaningful change within our university environments. Thank you, Vuyo.
We then have a follow-up question from Claire again. What is the role of deans, Sianne? In my experience, deans are key partners and of course gatekeepers. To what extent is institutional transformation impacted by its geographic location?
Sure, so I'll take that question. It's a really important question, one that we grappled with. Well, I grappled with when I implemented my research. I specifically wanted to go to different parts of South Africa to test how inclusion can be enabled and hindered. And what was evident is that the variables of culture, religion, class had an influential role on the transformation program, and that influence either enabled or hindered access to the program. The program was aimed at ensuring that marginalized populations were better included and supported within the university environment. So in my mind, apart from the difference between the geographical location of the universities was located in those three variables, culture, religion, and class. Ultimately, despite those variables, the same outcomes, programmatic outcomes were achieved, and that was really through the agentic power of the program leads, the transformation agents, as we call them, in moving and negotiating and advocating for change. Thank you, Rio.
The Higher Education Act clearly articulates the role of the IF. However, IF is not represented on council. In what manner would the IF perform its role effectively?
I take it that is directed to me. Yes. Well, quite correct. You know that the IFs are not, represented in the main. However, there are in our universities, that also make provision for the chairs of IFs to serve on university councils. But there is actually a debate in terms of whether that actually is supposed to be best serve the interests of the IFs. One school of thought, for example, argues that having at least a representation of the IFs at council itself is able, to bring to the fore, the context and the nuances of discussions and debates that will have happened at the IF when it makes its advice, or it gives its advice to council. However, the other school of thought says, well, definitely then that can create actually a tension, between its advisory role, that keep your distance, then render your advice, and then allow then councils, then to make a determination whether they accept it or perhaps also whether actually they don't accept it, but allow them, but at least expect them to indicate why they have, for instance, not taken your advice on board. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. George. And then we have our final question. What do you think of universities having an ombudsman? Any of the two can.
I think my colleague, I'll defer to her first, and then I'll come after Cyan.
Thank you, Vuyo. That's a really important question, and it's an important question because I think that I am in favor of having a university ombudsman. I think ombudsman play an incredible role between universities and the public. I think that it is always useful to have more remedies available, more mechanisms available for people who need to find support, either within the university or members of public who are affected by the university. And so I think ombudsman, the ombud helps neutralize power and advocate for change in ways that perhaps internal stakeholders of the university may not be able to achieve or produce similar outcomes. I think that we have a lot of learning, good practice within South Africa as well as internationally around the efficacy of ombud. And I think from my own experience, my office oversees discrimination and harassment in addition to other transformation work for the university. We know that we have built in a referral mechanism whereby if the system fails, the internal system fails a complainant, then at least the ombud can be approached as the first port of call before moving to our Chapter 9 institutions as an external remedy for recourse. Thank you, Vuyo.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Perhaps actually to just latch on to what Sianne was saying, I think we have every reason as higher education to embrace, this role and function of ombuds offices in our universities. There's so much that happens. For example, if we were to talk just about workplace bullying, for argument's sake, in the event that someone is being bullied by the chair of council, where do you find recourse? Do you find recourse in higher education, actually internally, for example? So it becomes very, very important that, and I like actually what Sianne was saying, that there has to be, she was implying a close working relationship, perhaps, between these transformation offices and the ombuds, because sometimes there is value and merit in ensuring that some of these issues that actually are raised will have been ventilated internally. All the structures will have actually had an opportunity to try and resolve whatever was in dispute. But ombuds themselves actually, play a crucial role, and hence, they are not only independent, but also they report directly where they function to the chair of council. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the two speakers. And let me thank you, colleagues, for your questions and the engagement. And I hope that was fruitful. And I'm now going to hand over to Rachel.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Vuyo said, I'm Rachel Chasakara from the Transformation Office. It gives me great pleasure to propose a vote of thanks on this memorable event. First and foremost, I would like to thank our special guests, Mr. Mvalo and Dr. Alves, for their valuable contribution to this series. I'd also like to thank our organizing partners, Prof. Keat and Dr. Lewandau, who have ensured that this project is a memorable success. I also wish to express my gratitude to all those present here and all those who have asked questions. The engagement is really profound and insightful. I would like to acknowledge the efforts of my colleagues, Mr. Mabena, Ms. Ngofe, and Ms. Ndija for their logistical support. Once again, I thank you all for your attendance.